Hi everyone, good evening. My name is Enzo. I work here at McNally Jackson. Thanks so much for being here with us tonight. We're really excited for this event. Just some housekeeping reminders. We have a Q&A at the very end of the event. If you have any questions, you can hold them for later. Afterward, feel free to join us downstairs. Where Holly will be signing books, and we're also going to be having our wine bar open until 9 p.m. So feel free to mingle. And don't forget to tip our bartenders. And I'm just going to introduce, first I'll introduce Mai Ishizawa, and I'll introduce our authors tonight. So Mai Ishizawa was born in Sendai, Japan, and currently lives in Germany. Her debut novel, The Place of Shells, won the Akutagawa Prize. Holly Barton is a writer and Japanese translator based in Bristol. She has published 2 books, 50 Sounds and Porn, an Oral History, and her translations include Miyako Kanai's Mild Vertigo and Ayako Matsuda's Where the Wild Ladies Are. And Liza St. James is a contributing editor at BOM, a senior editor of literary annual Noon, and a writing fellow in the School of Art at Cooper Union. She is a 2024 NYSCA NYFA Artist Fellow in Fiction. And without further ado, thank you.
Is it green?
Now it's green?
Yeah, really loud. We'll try it.
Hi.
Yes.
It's working. Yay. So I'm really excited to get to be here to celebrate the New York launch of this book. And we're gonna start. Is the mic working? Okay.
Yep.
We're gonna start off with a reading. And then we'll talk.
Hi everyone. Is this right?
Yeah.
Is it green?
It is green. Yes. It's a real pleasure to be here. So I'm going to read from the very start of the book. Just a few paragraphs. Standing in the shade of the deserted station, I awaited the arrival of a visitor whose face had half vanished. Whenever I managed to sift through my memories and cobble together some form of resemblance, it would slip apart like water the next moment. Still, I would continue, gathering up the little pieces, forcing them inside the outline of a head to create a collaged image. The repetition of this act filled me with a sensation of cowardice, not unlike probing an aching tooth with one's tongue over and over. The early July sun grew ever whiter, unsparing the heat it exuded. Its rays oversaturated the colours of things, while simultaneously returning everything to monochrome. In the glistening white square in front of the station, there wasn't a single shadow. People sat at a distance from each other on benches, like stone statues able to withstand this heat without melting. These figures, held transfixed by the sun, found their contrast in the figure of a black dog weaving around them. The dog was circling the transparent water that rose in jets from the square. There were several fountains installed among the cobblestones, from which water would spurt at irregular intervals. Like plants made of glass with an impossibly fast life cycle, the slender columns would shoot up to about the height of a child, bloom and burst into flower, and then quietly wilt away, leaving only a dark circular stain behind. The dog twisted its body joyfully as it cavorted with these watery snakes, glistening white and transparent. Each time the jets of water lost their shape and shrank away, the dog would go bounding over to a different fountain. Of every living thing in sight, he was the only one who seemed to be enjoying himself, oblivious to the weight of the sun. Beside the square of bleached cobblestones in front of Göttingen station lay a forest of interlocking bicycles. The bicycles had been intricately threaded into the gaps of the parking rack, the metal of their frames winking with a powerful light that even this sun was incapable of melting. 3 years after first encountering it, I still didn't know how this complex physical structure maintained its balance. As I was watching, a cyclist approached and braked hard, slid the bicycle he'd been riding in one of the openings in the metal forest, and then came dashing towards the station. Deftly cloaking his face with his mask as he ran, he vanished inside the doors and was swallowed up by the building. That forest, now one vehicle more complex, had become such a dense mass that its appearance no longer seemed connected in any way to bicycles. As the light traced its surface, an image rose up in my mind of another kind of mound, assembled from those objects whose meanings had dissolved, and this too began to throb, just like the toothache.
Thank you for that reading. It was a pleasure to hear it, and I think I was especially interested in having Polly read from the very beginning of the book to start, just because this book is about so many large subjects. It takes place during the pandemic, but it's sort of has to do with the 2011 earthquake, tsunami, and Fukushima disaster, and there's just so much sort of grief laden in the prose that I feel like it's very important to hear the prose, and that opening is particularly striking because of the subtlety. And yeah, when we were talking before this, Polly, you were saying that you were describing the moment when you kind of felt like this was a book unlike others. So I wonder if you could share more about like what happens right after this.
Yeah, so it's very sort of richly descriptive, slow start. She's waiting for someone at the station and we don't really know what's going on. It's kind of mysterious, and then very subtly it's kind of, well, it's not even subtle, it's just very casually dropped in that the person that she's waiting for is in fact a ghost. But it's not, it's not dwelled upon, and so we were saying you kind of do the literary equivalent of a double take in a way. And I feel like those moments are littered throughout the book, right? That there's a lot of symbolism, a lot of heavy, big topics, and yet often the most crucial parts aren't kind of stressed within that framework. It's a really intriguing book. Kind of unlike any other that I've read, which is always the thing that makes me think like, oh, maybe I would quite like to translate this.
And the dog who we meet in that opening, just to sort of emphasize what you're saying, that dog is actually a dog that the narrator is taking care of, and you find that out later, and the dog ends up being as much of a character kind of as any of the characters, I would say, maybe even one of the main characters. The dog is a truffle hunting dog. Yeah, I don't know how. But okay, so the dog, I don't know, I guess this is where we didn't talk about, I don't think that this is I don't really believe in spoilers, but I don't think that this is a book that could be spoiled, and actually this is something that I hope we're going to get to too, is like the sort of the shape of this book. But yeah, so the dog ends up, the truffles that the dog finds ends up being memory attributes. So the dog finds all kinds of things in the forest outside of Göttingen, where the book is set, for the most part.
Originally trained as a real truffle finder, but then he starts unearthing these kind of very strange, anachronistic objects, right?
Yeah, the dog goes rogue, and totally.
Spoiler.
But also time is very unstable.
Yes.
So time is unstable. The earth is unstable. We're gonna read a section. You're gonna read a section about the earth being unstable. But before that, I guess we should talk about sort of how much symbolism is in this book. I mean, every single name, so all the characters are named, I mean, the narrator's not named, but all the characters have names that are saints for them, pretty much. And yeah, every single just there's tons of symbols in this book. We've mentioned the memory attributes, but each one is sort of symbolizes something for each character. So the dog, and there's this character Ursula who kind of sets up a room in her home that's full of all these memory attributes, kind of like an exhibit. So I guess I'm curious, like, translating this, how much you felt like you had to sort of go down all these avenues of research for all these symbols.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's something that I think about not just with reference to this book, but with reference to a lot of the fiction projects that I work on. Because obviously it's important to be informed and not to miss references and to sort of understand the subtle allusions that are being made. And I think particularly for me as a translator, because the sensory and rhythmical qualities are so important. Like I want to feel like I can feel that, in a kind of a sensory way, as opposed to just a kind of rational understanding. That feels really important. At the same time, I think I'm quite aware of, particularly when I'm working on the first draft, which is a really important part of the process for me, sort of wanting to respond to the book in real time, and my first draft is always really fast and rough, and because I want to capture the pace of what's happening in the original, and so the balance between those two things is quite a delicate one for me. And I think often what I'm doing is, on the first draft, I won't really do any research or very little research, and then somewhere between the first and second draft, around the second draft, that's when the research will come. In terms of this book specifically, actually the first book that I ever translated was a non-fiction book about the tsunami in this particular area, and it was written by a professor, and I was living in Japan at the time, and ahead of me translating it, he took me there, and that was a time when the kind of reconstruction efforts were still stalling in progress, and so I got to see a lot of the kind of, a lot of the things that alluded to in this book, basically the kind of the huge mounds of rubble and the kind of great gaps between, the sort of clear line that you could see where the tsunami had come up to, because up to here it was buildings and then it was just flat nothingness. And the book largely consisted of the experiences of people who had gone through that. And so that already felt quite vivid to me. And then I guess the other thing that I was sort of familiar with as well was the art history. I spent a lot of time translating art catalogues, so a lot of that kind of vernacular was also familiar to me. Much less familiar was the and actually I had also lived in Germany, so a lot of these things were familiar, but religious iconography, which is what the protagonist is doing her PhD in, was not. So that was something that I did a fair bit of research into, around the second draft stage, I would say. And yeah, the one of the other kind of symbolic layers of this book is the cosmos, and it's set in Göttingen, which has this thing called a Planetenweg, which I had not encountered before despite living in Germany, but it's apparently quite a common thing in relatively small German towns, where you have kind of models of the solar system, that scale models of the solar system that are kind of spaced throughout the city, and their distance corresponds to the distances in the solar system. And when she's walking with the ghost, she's kind of narrating that in the original, the first scene, and then it comes to play a kind of more key role in the story. But I did a lot of research into that, a lot of kind of looking at maps and Google images and sort of really trying to like steep in the visuals of that and the geography of that. Sorry, that was an extremely long answer.
No. Yeah, the planets kind of come to take on. I mean, you find them. There's a Jupiter Tort. There's like candies that are shaped like planets. So the symbols, I mean, they go all the way from iconography to kind of just the everyday landscape is laden with symbols. But yeah, your response to that kind of preempted a question that I had while reading, which is, yeah, like, what is it, how did it feel to sort of translate something that, that just is so devastating, you know, for the people. Like, the earthquake and tsunami are part of the narrator. Like, the narrator is sort of trying to get close to the memory of the grief, and sort of like what it felt like, what it feels like in the body. And so, yeah, you kind of already got to that a bit, but I guess you said that was like the first book you did, and the first book you translated, and your first visit there. And I'm curious, like, what it felt like. I'm kind of, if there's anything more you want to add to like what it felt like to translate this, or if you.
Yes, I mean, I think that first book where it was, you know, first-hand accounts of survivors of the tsunami, and the area, the specific area that was hit by the tsunami, it was like full-on devastating. And I think this working with this book was really, really interesting for me because it dealt with something that I had lots and lots of conversations with Japanese friends about, which Japanese friends who weren't living in the particular area that was affected by the tsunami, which is a kind of, I mean, it's hard to find the precise word for it. One word that she uses is a kind of guilt. But it's not just guilt, it's not just sort of guilt for not having experienced it directly. It's almost this sense that, like, I don't know if I am permitted to have feelings about this, because there are people who have suffered in a terrible, devastating way, and my suffering, I mean, this person, for clarity, the protagonist does come from Fukushima, but was kind of in an inland region, and so she experienced the earthquake, but no one that she knew apart from this ghost, Nomiya, was, you know, lost their lives or was particularly affected by it. And so kind of navigating in a way, the book is a journey of her reckoning with that guilt, right? And reckoning with this kind of the suppressed feelings and the kind of finally, again, spoiler, but sort of ending essentially with her giving herself permission to feel grief, right? That's the kind of the place that she arrives to after all of this. And so I think I agree with you that it is devastating, but it's sort of devastating at a remove, like an unconscious or a subconscious devastatingness, and sort of a wrestling with that, which for me was like inseparable from the kind of circularity of the narrative and the sentences and the sort of, there would be times when I was translating these sentences and like finding something difficult, and a childish part of me would be like, why can't you just say this in a simple way? Like, why are we going through these sort of motions? And then I would remind myself, oh yes, because this is a description of a psychological state, right, that expresses itself in a very stylistic way that was kind of fascinating to me.
Yeah, that state. So the whole book to me did kind of feel like a spell, or like a some kind of like fugue state. I mean, there's something about the prose there's something really odd about the prose that I think allows for this state. And yeah, I guess do you, when you're working on multiple projects at once, how do you try to keep the tone? Like this, to me, this seems like a book that, like, so you do your one draft, you do your first fast draft, and then how do you kind of come back to channeling this?
It's a really good question. So we were talking a little bit in the back room about kind of doing multiple projects at a time, and I'm now in a position where more or less I'm more or less a full-time literary translator, which means I do roughly 4-5 books a year. And in the case of this one, I was working on this kind of concurrently with 2 other projects. But they happened to be so different in style, content, style, everything, that there kind of was no confusing them, no room for mixing them up. I think were I doing 3 books that were kind of more similar, that would be much more of an issue for me. And I think I would start sort of getting lost. But because, and actually, yeah, it goes on, like at the moment I'm working on different things, but again, they're like so stylistically distinct that that makes it much easier for me, I think, because I don't have to do any compartmentalizing. It does it itself. I sort of open up the Japanese and I'm instantly there. Or like if I'm just working from the English draft, I'm instantly there because it's such a sort of distinct world, I suppose. Yeah.
Because you brought up the ending and the narrator sort of like allowing herself to get close to these feelings and things like that. I guess we did also talk before this about the shape of this book. This book has a really alluring shape that I think really does kind of mirror the cover, and the sentences, and it's this kind of spirally, and the sort of planet models.
Can you hear the ocean if you put your ear up to the book?
Good try. But yeah, and I guess so. I was sort of talking about how like a book came out a few years ago called Meander, Spiral, Explode. That was kind of like, we don't need to have the Aristotelian model of like a narrative arc. You can find these shapes and patterns in nature. And I was just sort of asking Polly, like, what are there other books kind of that you feel like this shape reminded you of, or and we were also sort of just talking about the ending and how it's there is like a true ending, I think. So
yeah, I mean, I think now that Japanese fiction in translation is so hot, you know, a question that I often get asked is why? Like, why do you think that people are drawn to reading Japanese fiction? And I think there's a number of different ways of answering that question. And it, you know, it depends on what kind of Japanese fiction they're reading. But I do feel that a lot of Japanese fiction that skews towards the literary end is often presenting kind of narrative structures that we don't commonly see in Anglophone fiction. And it, you know, they don't always kind of totally reinvent the wheel. Like we've seen, this is kind of has a cyclical, circular, slightly convoluted structure, but it does have, you know, a kind of cathartic ending that we would recognize in the West as a kind of ending-y ending, right? Whereas other books might have a less convoluted structure but end in a way that kind of will shock readers here. I translated a collection of stories that I worked on by an author called Tomoka Shibasaki, has just come out, and I feel like they are very much playing with the expectations of readers in terms of what a story needs to do in all ways. But before working on those, I worked on a novel by her, which also ends in a way that some people found amazing, some people found incredibly frustrating. My brother was like, I felt really angry with her. But, you know, challenging, right? Like doing things that people feel, I feel like if you are getting angry with an author of a book that you've previously been invested in up until that point, at least it's sort of challenging your preconceptions about what a story needs to look like and this kind of Aristotelian progression.
Yeah. Now I need to read that to know. Yeah. I think that's a good sign if you're getting mad. So this writer clearly also cares about translation. From reading this, that was what I was feeling. Like there's a lot of moments where like sort of the beginning of a word is played with, or there's like a whole section on kanji versus, well, there are kanji, there's kanji versus katana in the book. Yeah, how did that feel for you to encounter, I guess, as a translator, like somebody who is writing, thinking about, you know, I hope most writers think about words a lot, but not all of them do, and you know, it's nice to read somebody who is clearly choosing the exact words.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's, you know, it's relatively rare, I would say, to translate, well, to even to read Japanese authors who are based outside of Japan and like clearly engaging with a kind of linguistic, a totally different linguistic reality in the way that I feel like is analogous to what I was experiencing in Japan, and my sense is that sort of that experience naturally gives rise to considerations about Japanese in relation, you know, German here is functioning as a kind of triangulation point, right, for her to kind of consider the Japanese language throughout history, and I love to see that there is then the question of what to do about that as a translator, because she's very clearly writing about Japanese for Japanese speakers who know a lot about the Japanese language and will understand the differences between kanji and katakana and all of this stuff. And so there's always the question of, within fiction, how much explaining can we do? How I guess the kind of the core judgment is like, how key is this to what's going on and the symbolism? Like, is it worth doing a lot of work to explain it, or is it just a passing reference that actually is probably better elided rather than kind of making a big thing out of, which then gives it sort of significance that it doesn't have in the original text. We ended up, so there's lots of talk about the old Japanese names for German cities. So the kind of before katakana, which is the kind of the alphabet that's now used mostly to represent foreign words. Before that was used for place names, they were given kanji, so kind of ideographic characters, which kind of brought into existence this whole sort of semantic iconography associated with like Dusseldorf or Hanover or whatever, and she's sort of giving examples of that and the stories that she attached to them. And I felt like this was really important to the symbolic universe of the book, but also I really wanted to, if possible, just kind of have those kanji on the page, so for people who did understand them, that they could see them, and even for those who didn't, I think just to kind of give a sense, give some sort of visual element to what you're talking about. So I spoke with my editor Tynan, and he agreed that it was important to have them in. So they're in there, which it's makes me really happy, because I don't think that many editors would have agreed to that, but also, yeah,
it's a treat to encounter them, and it does feel really important, I think, in part because where this takes place is a very scholarly, like there's a university there, the Max Planck Institute is there, all of these sort of people associated with the university are going to Ursula's house for her Kisakuchin or whatever, and you know, she's hosting them, and they're all sort of gravitated to her for their, I think what's called lexical indigestion by the narrator. So you know, they're all kind of like most of them are not from there. They're sort of meeting through her, and getting to know each other and through these sort of odd rituals and, you know, conversations at her house. But so one of the sort of things that she does is hosts a dinner where the theme is shells. So everybody is sort of bringing something that has to do with shells.
Madeleines and like wine with a shell on the front on the picture, and
And so the narrator calls this group the Thursdayers because they go on Thursdays, and so part of one of the parts that I loved the most were these sort of congregations of the Thursdayers, and maybe now's a good time for you to read that.
Yeah. As I began going over to Ursula's regularly, I grew familiar with the faces of her other Thursday visitors. Among them was Agnes, a girl of around 12. She lived with her mother, Barbara, in one of the apartments across the courtyard. At first, she'd started coming to Ursula's with her mother, but had subsequently slipped free from her mother's grasp, and now came of her own accord, ascending to the rank of a Thursdayer in her own right. Ursula altered neither her tone of voice nor her behaviour when interacting with children, yet, With the acuity peculiar to children, Agnes had perceived Ursula's dependability as a listener. Behind their closeness, you could sense a sticky sort of neediness in Agnes, but she never overstepped the boundaries. She never showed up at Ursula's outside of the stipulated time on Thursday. The way Agnes maintained her distance from others had a lot to do with her anxious nature. And it was only after first sheltering in the shadow of her cautiousness, while carefully and silently observing the other party, that she would attempt to narrow this distance with words. She understood the gap that existed between the Thursdayers and herself, but sometimes she would intentionally ignore it, or cleverly use it to her advantage. After a certain point, she started to loosen up with me, but beneath her apparent amicability lurked a sharp curiosity. I appreciated her honesty, but also couldn't trust her unconditionally. I knew how that kind of forthrightness could become a needle that pierced people as she was speaking to them, without her awareness. In her case, that needle had been stitched inside a particular amusing anecdote. When Agnes found out that I was from Japan, she'd unleashed this treasured story of hers, her trembling lips forming a sniggering, cat-like grin. Last summer, Agnes had gone with a school friend to buy ice cream from a large cafe overlooking the square where the former city hall stood. The ice cream shop was busy in summer, and a snaking line of people would form in front of its doors. Directly in front of Agnes and her friend stood a young couple, a German man and a Japanese woman. The pair stuck their heads out from the line to look at the palette-like array of multicolored ice cream flavors in the window. "What's your favorite flavor?" the man asked the woman. "I like earthquake flavor." A moment later, a burst of laughter flew out of the man's mouth. "Strawberry, you mean strawberry," he corrected her. "Wow, Japanese people sure eat weird stuff." At this, she too began to laugh, slapping him gently on the shoulder. In German, Erdbeeren, strawberries, and Erdbeben, earthquakes, which both took their beginnings from the word Erd or Erde, meaning earth, were sufficiently similar, so their sounds got mixed up sometimes in both the memory and the mouth. This earthquake-flavored ice cream story was guaranteed to provoke laughter and was one of Agnes's favorite anecdotes. That mix-up of words didn't leave any kind of bad taste in her mouth, which explained why, for a while, she retold the story over and over like a party trick. And when I was present, she'd always ask me the same question: "Do you like earthquake flavor too?" Seeing her face dusted with laughter like cake crumbs, I could only shrug in reply. It didn't matter, she wasn't particularly interested in my response anyway. The story was perfectly shaped as it was, and the question she asked me afterwards was only a kind of flourish. The fact that my hometown had been damaged by a recent earthquake, the fact that most Japanese people had earthquakes sensorially inscribed into their bodies, these visceral realities were too remote for her to gauge their distance. If I were to tell these people living in a place where earthquake was only an abstract word, that I still carried the physical sensations of a far-off land within me, would my comment not be dismissed as outlandish and promptly forgotten about? Yet the distance between words and embodied experiences whirled and eddied inside me too. My images of words like war, air raid, and volcanic eruption weren't accompanied by any physical sensations. I felt an emotional connection with the word tsunami, yet ultimately I'd never seen one in real life. Quite possibly, to those who'd lived with that word carved into their bodies, who'd seen that wall of water before their eyes, this connection of mine would seem like a sentimental miscalculation of emotional distance on my part. I couldn't shake the feeling that as my body and my senses acclimatized to this earthquake-free country, that word was losing its heft for me too. Every time I read an article online about Japan's earthquakes, typhoons, or heavy rains, that suspicion would lodge itself further within me. I suspected that on the underside of this particular emotion lay all my memories of that March day, the places that stayed with me even now, and the sensations I attached to certain words, which I worried constituted a betrayal of Nomiya.
hearing you read that reminded me that I was also curious because of how much attention the writer is paying to every, the sort of words and the distance between words and what they're symbolizing. Were there any parts of this that you really struggled over, like, while translating?
What was the last thing you said? Sorry.
Were there any really, really tricky parts to translate? Like, I'm thinking there's a whole sort of passage on the difference between landscapes and portraits of places, for instance. Like, there's all these sorts of, it's very interior, and there's all these sorts of questions that the narrator is thinking about, like, sort of, how do I think about a landscape of a place versus the portrait of a place versus, like, actually I started looking at aerial views, and there's all these sorts of strange moments like that. And I was curious, like, while you were translating, I don't know, it's also a very pattern-heavy book, where, like, because of this sort of shape of the spiral, and because of the planet model, they're all sort of going on this pilgrimage, because of how cyclical it is and all those sorts of things. Was there anything that you felt like, oh, actually, I want to go back to all the instances of that word and redo it, or anything like that kind of, I know it's a little while ago, so.
Yeah, there was actually so much in this book that I really struggled with. There's a huge amount of repetition in the Japanese. I mean, Japanese readers, or Japanese is a language that permits more repetition than English. So that's always a thing when you're translating into English, that do we leave this repetition? Do we shake things up? Like, how to respond to that? But in this book, it felt particularly difficult. Also, kind of, I would say that there's a lot of use of, like, a lot of talk about time and space, and the layering of time and space, the layering of different times, and a lot of the kind of vocabulary around seeing and hearing, where eyes and ears are used sort of symbolically to mean seeing and hearing. Like, all of that is much less marked in Japanese than it would be in English, but within the book it's like carried to a point and repeated to a point where it does become quite marked. But to translate that literally into English, it would make it really very strange indeed, in a way that it isn't in Japanese, and yet, within this sort of symbolic universe, and sort of talking about the severed parts of saints and icons a lot. Sort of there's severed breasts and eyes. So, this kind of talking about eyes and ears is not unrelated to that. There was just this constant question of, like, how to manage that, sort of walking the tightrope, I suppose, between wanting to stay faithful to that symbolic universe, but not wanting the English to become sort of overly laboured or unreadable in a way that the Japanese isn't.
That's really interesting, because one of the things I was marking as I was reading was all the faces that appear.
Oh my gosh, yes.
So there's, like,
yes.
A face surfaces amid a patch of land or the town inside the frame. That's a sentence. Or even that going back to the very first sentence of the book, the second half of it is, I awaited the arrival of a visitor whose face had half vanished.
Right.
So and that's before we know that this visitor is no longer like the other people among this narrator, except
And I think, like, Tynan and I had quite a lot of explicit conversations about that, right? Where we were like, this is strange in English, and it's stranger than it would be in Japanese because face has more of a kind of, it's used symbolically more often. But I think particularly with that first line, the half vanished face, it felt really important to have it there, even if that meant that it was a slightly more odd sentence in English than it would be in the Japanese. Because some kind of metaphorical resemblance or whatever wouldn't quite be doing the ghostly work that I think needs like that's we don't understand it at the time when we first read it, but when we look back it's like, oh, that's because he's a ghost, and I think we need to sort of have some of that there, you know. But it is this constant process of sort of weighing things up, and you know, I this is always true for me with translation, of sort of accepting that you're never going to get it all right, you know, sort of tick all the boxes, that it is a process of compromise, and I think with this book that felt particularly clear, because symbolically there's just and linguistically there's so much going on, and you sort of have to prioritize is a horrible way of putting it, but you sort of have to get clear what is most important in this particular scenario, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's tons of metaphors in here, and that is what a metaphor
Yes.
is. It's like that compromise, basically.
Yeah.
But on the note of the ghostly work, I think that's when we maybe go to questions. The ghostly work. There's questions from the audience.
Yeah, I guess kind of going into what you were talking about, repetition and figuring out the best way to replicate it in English in the same way it is in Japanese. Did you also think of it as like a haunting because of this ghost element too, and the, I guess for lack of a better word, survivor's guilt that the protagonist also feels? Like was that another element that you were thinking of when you were trying to figure out how to render that in English, or?
The repetition kind of marks a haunting in a way. No, but I love that. Maybe not explicitly a haunting, but I suppose yes, the sort of circling back to things. Yeah, yes, this kind of preoccupation and circling round something rather than being able to sort of look directly at it. Yeah, a haunting and a sort of a symbol of the kind of emotional repression, I think, in a way. Yeah, but that's a really nice way of putting it. Yeah, thank you.
Change to my audience hat. I lead the International Literature Book Club at McNally Jackson,
Mhm.
and we did a series of Japanese novelists, and we read Mild Vertigo.
Mm.
And I was wondering if you would speak to, for example, the titles in the book, like the title of that is so perfect for that book, and this title, and how your relationship to the translation of the titles, and which, you know, does so much to draw an English audience in.
Yeah, thank you for that.
And it's a wonderful translation, by the way. I recommend it to anyone. Mild Vertigo is like incredible.
Thank you. Yeah, both of those titles presented challenges, I would say, to translate. Sometimes titles more or less just translate themselves, and I would say with those two, that was not the case. So actually, before I had a contract to translate Mild Vertigo, there was an article in the Paris Review which mentioned Mild Vertigo and already discussed how the title should be translated. And that someone had written an article about it, and they'd initially translated it as I'm going to get this right, light dizziness, but then revised it to be faint vertigo because they felt that it was a reference to Roland Barthes and Hitchcock.
Yeah.
And that I read that and it really stressed me out. I was like, how on earth am I going to do this, and what should I do? And I resolved just to sort of not think about it. And then as I was translating it, it sort of came to me that the word meaning light, it needed to have a kind of medical ring. You know, like it needed to be, okay, this is something that could be a medical condition if it was
The terminology,
severe.
yes.
But it was, you know, so it wasn't faint and it wasn't like, it was mild, you know, and that became quite obvious, and mild dizziness doesn't work, so mild vertigo kind of came to me, and then I felt quite sure in that. The original Japanese title of The Place of Shells is we had a super literal placeholder for a while, right, which was something like the road to which the shells lead. And I think we knew that like there was no way that it could be that, but kind of neither of us felt comfortable like simplifying it, so it kind of stayed like that for a while. And then I can't remember how it happened, but we sort of, given the content of the book, kind of came to the feeling that Place of Shells really worked within that kind of symbolic universe. I remember having a conversation with Tyson on the phone where we talked for about 10 minutes about whether it should be or the. But then kind of, I think, eventually settled on the, and then got the author's approval, and she was very happy with it, I think, as a title.
Are there other words that you would like to share with us? Like, are there words like chambers or, you know, literally nautilus or shells like that you would share with the audience for insight into your process?
Chambers, did you say?
Yes, I was thinking of the chambers of the nautilus shell.
I remember the literal translation, if you typed it into Google, was where the oysters go. Which would have been an absurd title.
Wow.
Wow,
And
that's...
it made me think that translators will be in jobs for a while.
Where the oysters go? That's so bizarre. Huh. Because the word in Japanese does not mean oysters, so Google is doing something. Yeah.
And at their shell dinner, they do talk about like different kinds of shells.
Yeah, they do.
And
okay.
sort of
Yeah.
go into some of the terms that might come up.
I can't
around
wait to read it.
different shells.
Yeah.
But that is something that I was curious about too, is your correspondence with the author. Like, were there other places that you kind of
I wasn't
No,
actually in
correspondence.
touch with her at all, and haven't been.
Huh.
And would really like to meet her, but no, we weren't in touch. Yeah, that kind of went through the publisher. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Polly. I had a question. A lot of the sort of emotions that you were describing, like survivor's guilt, really reminded me a lot of some like third generation Holocaust books that I've read about Germany, where the grandchild of a Holocaust survivor is going to Germany and feels like triggered by some things and sensitive, just as you're saying about this narrator, sort of like words mean something to them that they don't to other people there, but at the same time they're aware that they are not actually the person who experienced those things, and they also feel kind of like imposter in a way. So I found that really interesting to hear about that experience of Göttingen from like a totally different perspective, but so similar in many ways. And I was wondering, and sorry, I came here late, so this question may have already been covered, but like, how the place of Göttingen kind of is apparent, like how that functions in the story.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really great point, and it's in there, right? She talks a lot about. There's a point towards the end of the book where the city starts kind of slipping back in time, and we are going back to kind of bits of Nazi Germany, and she talks about the Steppenstein, and the way that this is another question, right? With this sense of like monuments and how we mark history, and how it's dealt with in Germany as opposed to in Japan. So that's very much in there.
The train station that we kind of see at the start comes back again, but it's in a previous time.
Yes.
Multiple times, I think, actually, and there is a character too. I mean, there's so much. This book is it's slim novel,
right,
but there's so much. It's like we could actually.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's a scientist who comes back, Tarada, who is a scientist, and he was there before then. But like basically, we're going through a bunch of different time periods.
Yes. And she goes on a walk and she starts sort of smelling smoke, and it turns out that it's from the book burning. And we've gone back in time. So, yeah, she's very much aware of that parallel, but yeah, I really appreciate you bringing that up.
Pressure is on. So I have a question about location in relation to Japan, in sort of the broader landscape of Japanese fiction right now. Would you say there's a healthy sort of processing of this 2011 disaster across, with other authors, with other writers? Does that still continue? Things reach us in English later than, obviously, the original Japanese, but just talking about the 2011 disaster, I lived in Sendai many years prior to the earthquake, so I'm just curious, and I know the author's from there, but yeah, just kind of how does the processing of the disaster kind of fit within what you see as current Japanese literature?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I feel like there was a time, probably 5 years, the kind of 5-year period after, when that was more or less what everyone was writing fiction about, who was writing about kind of contemporary themes. And I think you're right. I think a lot of it has not made its way over into English, in part because it feels like such a kind of paradigm shift in the Japanese psyche in a way that just people do not have a sense of here. And so there's, that like there was an anthology called March Was Made of Yarn, which is a kind of a collection of Japanese stories translated into English that deal with the tsunami and the disaster, but fewer whole novels, I guess. But I think, as with this book, post-pandemic, we are seeing kind of more literature that's somehow sort of bringing out the comparison or like drawing on both of those. So this author that I mentioned before, that I've translated 2 books by, Tomoka Shibasaki, her latest book, which has not been translated yet into English, is doing something similar. And so the 2011 earthquake and tsunami, but also the Kobe earthquake, plus the pandemic. and sort of bringing out parallels between those in a really interesting way. So I think it is still being processed, and people are still finding new things to say about it. But I think there is a really interesting question around what does it look like for that to be translated into English when we sort of lack so much of the context that I think is self-evident to Japanese people, and so would feel sort of, it would be handled in fiction in a more oblique way, and my worry about translating a lot of that into English is that that context would just be missing, and so the sort of the heart of it wouldn't come across, if that makes sense. Thank you for the question.
Wow, well, thank you everyone for coming tonight. That was another round of applause. We'll be having a book signing downstairs. We have not only The Place of Shells, but also Holly's other book, Porn.
The only one that matters.
And we also have some copies of Mild Vertigo, and we also have a bar tab graciously covered by New Direction, so please get some drinks and have some fun, and let's move downstairs. Thank you.